Hello, everyone, and Happy New Year. Welcome to a Modern Sales Pros event. I'm super excited to get started with our illustrious guest here that we have here today, the one and only Michelle Van Zanna. We're here to talk about equipping today's Salesforce, challenge and solutions to the thorniest sales performance problems. But before we begin, I'll give folks a couple more minutes to trickle in, and I'd love to ask everyone, very top of mind now that we're heading into the new year of 2024. Michelle, do you have any New Year's resolution goals? And if not, that's totally okay. Some people don't believe in it, but
Yeah.
kind of want to see what you have.
Well, I don't really believe in New Year's goals. I believe in ongoing goals, but I actually do have one. And I'm getting ready to finalize a move. And
Ooh.
my New Year's resolution, actually for the next couple of years, maybe for the next 10 years, is not to move again. What can I do to ensure that I don't move again? That's my goal. That's my
That's a good
resolution.
goal. That's a fair goal. And yeah, I totally get you on not having a resolution. Some people don't believe in that, but I like to hold myself accountable as well. And my goal is to just be a little bit more active. I think I was a little bit stagnant, especially during the holidays. So I'm looking
Mm.
forward to up my running game. I just signed up for a half marathon, so
Oh,
that's really
nice.
exciting.
Wow.
I've never done that before, but hey, there's a first for everything.
That's right.
All right, let's get started and we'll begin. But first, I love to say a few words about the team at Modern Sales Pros. So, for those of you who are not familiar, Modern Sales Pros is one of the world's largest and highest quality community for those in sales management, sales leadership, sales and revenue operations, and enablement, aka our Modern Sales Pros. Our mission is to create an environment for our members to answer questions they struggle to solve on their own and help them to see around corners they may not know about. We do this through live sessions like the one you're at today. We also have an online robust forum. We also have our summits and we also have our in person events. So if you're not already a part of MSP, you'll be invited to join right after this event. And some few housekeeping notes. This event is being recorded, so if you have a friend or colleague who couldn't make it, rest assured this event will be made available on the MSP website before the end of the day. We'll also send it to you via email. And if you have a question for Michelle, please leverage the Q&A function at the top right-hand corner or leverage the chat, as well as let us know where you're calling in from. We'll leave the questions towards the end, which Michelle will answer live, so stay tuned for that. And I'm actually going to pass it off to Michelle to say a few words about Imparta, and then I'll come back for closing remarks. So, Michelle,
Excellent.
take it away.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Angelica. So, Imparta is one of the most innovative sales training companies in the marketplace. We hang our hat on the fact that we not only are very rigorous about how we equip salespeople and sales managers, but we do deep research into what separates the high performers from the rest of the pack. And we deploy our solutions, which are very robust globally. So proud to be part of the Imparta team. Angelica, am I on now or are we back? Here we go. Perfect. So I am Michelle Vazana. I recently, last August, joined Imparta as their Chief Innovation Officer through an acquisition. I was formerly one of the founders of Vantage Point Performance, and Vantage Point is thrilled to be part of the Imparta team now. I get the benefit of working all across the company, and more specifically with their founder and CEO, Richard Barkey, whom I'll talk about in just a little bit. So that's a little bit about Imparta, and that's a little bit about me. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share some slides with you to drive this discussion. And as Angelica mentioned, it's really about what are the solutions to some of the thorniest sales performance problems. And we're going to talk about performance problems really in three areas. In sales execution, what are the requirements and what goes wrong? What's going on in sales enablement? And what are some of the sales technology problems that really need to be solved in order to drive superior performance? As we unpack this session, I'm going to be sharing research from a variety of sources. I'm going to be sharing analyst research from Forrester and Gartner. I'm going to be sharing research from Imparta, some of that which is conducted internally within Imparta, some jointly with training industry. And I'm going to be sharing some research that came from the Vantage Point legacy into Imparta. So not only are we going to talk about these problems, we're going to talk about them from the perspective of what did we learn from the research that informs these problems, and how does that inform how we approach solving these problems? So let's talk about them individually real quickly, and then we'll unpack them one at a time. So from a sales execution perspective, there's a lot of sales methodologies out there that are very seller focused. They kind of work in theory, they sound good, but they don't work as well in practical application. And because of that, key commercial targets are not being met, and there's gaps or misalignment in training coverage. And we'll talk about all of these items. From a sales enablement perspective, a lot of events, a lot of training is still very event-based and oftentimes somewhat outdated. It includes skills that just don't stick and processes for deployment that don't necessarily drive that stickiness. And oftentimes, the sales enablement efforts, while very admirable, we tend to be slow to respond to new challenges, such as what happened with COVID, supply chain issues, needs for price increases, and that sort of thing. And from a sales technology perspective, what we find is there's a lot of expensive, relatively empty sales platforms. Lots of organizations out there have e-learning libraries, but they tend to get a little bit old and stagnant. And tech stacks tend to be missing some of the elements that are most useful for sellers in order to be able to apply what they need to apply within the flow of work. So let's unpack these individually, and we're going to start with sales execution. And we're going to start with some of the leading industry research from both Forrester and Gartner, and then we're going to supplement and augment that with some of our own research. So what does Forrester research have to say about sales methodologies and the challenges therein? And there's a really phenomenal paper. It's actually a research report. It's a vision report from Forrester, and the title of that report is Buyer Input is Critical when Developing a B2B Sales Methodology. And that was written by Jennifer Bullock, Peter Ostro, Eric Zines, Adam Bernberg, and Robin Whiting. So what I'm going to share with you now is really primarily from this paper and from these analysts. So one thing that they identify is the fact that the selling problem is not always clearly defined. And what do we mean by that? Well, different methodologies accomplish different things. So if the selling problem is not being able to drive value and ROI, that requires a different approach than one that involves really exploring customer needs using a consultative approach. So before you select which methodology you think you should deploy, make sure you understand the problem that you're solving. Another issue that they identify is that oftentimes implementation outcomes that are desired by these methodology deployments are either not understood or misunderstood. And Forrester's perspective on this is that you should really understand a complete picture of the program that you're deploying and the outcomes that you want. So are you measuring qualitative feedback? Are you measuring adoption? Are you measuring skill acquisition? Are you measuring business impact? All of those are really important aspects of determining whether an implementation was indeed successful. So due to a lot of these challenges with methodologies, they're frequently suffering from either low adoption or abandonment. In fact, Forrester asserts that less than 50% of sellers claim to use a formal sales methodology. And another interesting tidbit from Eric Zines, one of their key analysts in the area of sales methodology, he says that your highest performing sellers are the least likely to say they actually need a formal sales methodology. So these are some really interesting things to consider when you think about how you're trained, what you're trained on, and how that training is actually deployed. So Gartner has some really interesting perspectives on what you choose to train and the methodology you choose to train as well. And some of their recent findings have to do with the fact that buyers today are confused. They report receiving way too much information from sellers and sales organizations and organizations in general. Not only are they receiving too much information, but the information is credible and it's of pretty high quality. But the challenge is not only are they receiving too much information, that information is often conflicting. So what are they supposed to believe, and how do they figure it out? What happens when they receive this overabundance of conflicting information is making trade-offs between which solutions are the best fit is often difficult. And what the result is for sellers, it reduces the chances of making a viable sale for up to 66%. I mean, and that's just bad news for us as sellers. So what are some of the things that need to change in the way that we equip sellers to have superior execution? Well, let's go back to Forrester for a moment. What are some of the things that they assert need to be true if a sales methodology or a sales approach is to be effective and drive the outcomes that you want? Well, one of the things that they assert is critically important based on their research is that whatever approach you use, whatever methodology you select, needs to focus on buyer expectations. And what do we mean by that? What do we mean by focus on buyer expectations? Well, there's different buyer personas within organizations. And although those personas are all involved in a buying journey, they may experience those buying journeys somewhat differently. And they may be at different points along that buying journey at the same time. So understanding who those personas are, understanding their buying journeys and what their expectations are as they navigate those buying journeys is critically important. They also say you should really analyze buyer perceptions, because buyers are really getting a lot more demanding and wanting more personalized approaches to selling to them. And the buyer's perspective is going to have a huge impact on the actual approach that is used by the seller. So what we're hearing so far is that the buyer is king, the buyer's expectations matter most, and the buyer's perceptions should have the biggest impact on the approach that the seller plans to use. Whatever approach you decide to use, or whatever methodology you decide to adopt, really should mirror the behavior of high-performing sellers. And if it doesn't, there should be some really strong rationales as to why. We mentioned that buyers are demanding more personalized buying experiences, but they also want more streamlined buying experiences. They don't want unnecessary steps in order to buy from you. They don't want you to complicate their life. They want you to personalize their experience and streamline their experience. In addition, as sellers, we should anticipate the buyer's information needs at every step of their buying journey and anticipate how those needs might change based on the persona of the buyers that you're dealing with. Gartner has some similar suggestions on what needs to change with regard to sales execution and sales methodology. One of the things that Gartner spent a lot of time talking about over the last couple of years is this idea of situational awareness. And their point of view here is that buying situations differ. Personas differ within those buying situations. Sellers need to be ultra aware that different buying situations require different approaches. And when we say different approaches, they refer to that as situational tuning. So as a seller, I need to get much better at understanding and becoming aware of the buying situation I'm facing. And I need to get much more skilled at being able to determine how to adjust my sales approach accordingly in order to align with that buying situation. They even go so far as to suggest that information audits are a strong requirement. And this really relates back to Forrester's perspective as well, around the fact that buyers want you to understand their information needs at each stage of that buying journey. And an information audit would reflect how those needs change as the stage of their buying journey changes as well. Another interesting point that Gartner has brought up in one of their more recent conferences is the fact that you really should focus on the emotional aspects of the buying journey, right? Not just the sort of logical and tactical aspects of the buying journey. And Alice Walmsley, one of their senior analysts, goes so far as to say, feelings over facts, focus on feelings over facts. And all of this, when put together, aligns with Gartner's perspective on sense making. What do we mean by sense making? Well, it's this idea that I need to really assess and understand the buying situation I'm facing, the buyers I'm dealing with, the personas they represent, um, be able to not only understand what's going on with the buyer, but look across their landscape at the information and sources that they're likely to consider when making a purchase decision. So look at it from the not only the buyer's perspective, but across all of the information they're likely to utilize, and then help those buyers make sense of that information, narrow the field, and simplify their buying process. So that's really what Gartner means by sense making. And if you look at the points that we made from the Forrester research around understanding the buying journey, personalizing the buying journey, and the points made by Gartner, there's a lot of congruence in what the industry analysts are saying is critical in today's marketplace. So when we talk about this idea of research, Imparta has our own set of research, and I can't go through it all in this one short session. In fact, all of this research is detailed very granularly in our new book, The Sales Agility Code. So I would strongly urge, if you're interested in unpacking this research, that you at least consider getting that book and reading about the research and what it means. But if I'm going to give you the punchline, what we found when we took a look at over 4,000 deals and how sellers approach those deals is sellers in any given sales force face between 4 and 6 unique buying situations when they sell the solutions that they're tasked to sell. And not only do they face more than one buying situation, what we found is sellers actually display 4 different patterns of selling behavior or strategies. There's a consultative pattern, there's a disruptive pattern, there's a competitive and a financial pattern. And although consultative really is the primary driver of all of this, and the baseline and the foundation for all of this, once sellers understand the situation that they're facing, the highest performers often pivot to another strategy at different points along that sales process or along that buying journey. But what's critically interesting, really interesting about the findings here is that high performers pivot between strategies. Core performers only typically use one strategy no matter what the changes are in the buying situation. And so this is problematic on many levels, because when you think about sales enablement, which we'll talk about in just a moment, when you are launching a sales methodology, one of the reasons that you do that as a sales leader or sales enablement leader is you're trying to drive standardization. So if you launch a methodology, say it's a consultative selling methodology, you want your sellers using consultative selling. And what the research found is that doesn't necessarily work in all situations, especially if it's sort of a one-size procedural approach. If you're going to use a consultative approach, make sure it's an adaptive, agile approach that changes the tactics that you deploy based on where that buyer is within that buying journey. So this was a little bit of research around the sales agility element. I'm getting ready to share some other research, which is fascinating. And I had the privilege of unpacking this research with Imparta's CEO, Richard Barkey. So this research here really is more about decision-making and how that decision-making leads to changes in what you select to execute. The research I'm going to share with you now is really all about sales execution and what drives superior sales execution. And this research project, led by Imparta CEO Richard Barkey, he led a research team. It was a multi-year study. It was a qualitative study. And they took a look at over 120 individual sales behaviors. And their goal was to identify consistent patterns or dimensions that underpin these 120 sales behaviors. And they used a really interesting methodology called MECE, and it stands for mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. And it's really a sort of problem solving or categorizing methodology that drives clear thinking and defensible outcomes. And so Richard and his team at Imparta, they use this MECE methodology to identify what are all the possibilities of dimensions underpinning all of these 120 individual sales behaviors. And the reason it took several years is because when you use this methodology, this MECE approach, you have to come up with hypotheses about what are these dimensions that underpin these 120 behaviors. And they went through hundreds of different hypotheses. And once they put them through this Nisi approach, they threw them out. And finally, after about over a couple of years and hundreds of different hypotheses about what are these dimensions that sellers use that drive superior performance, they landed on a really interesting insight. And like with most research, once you come up with the answer, it seems pretty obvious. But the findings here were of all of these selling behaviors, the dimensions that underpin every one of them are these elements of insight, influence, and trust. And if you take a look at these different sales behaviors, if you unpack them however you want to, any given sales behavior is designed to create one of three things: either provide insight for the buyer, influence the buyer's behavior, or build trust with the buyer. And what was really interesting about this finding of these three dimensions that underpin pretty much every single sales behavior is that all three of these dimensions are actually important in sales execution. And let me give you an example of why. If you look across the landscape in the sales training industry, you'll see that there are some sales training methodologies that lean heavily into insight, right? Think Challenger, right? They're all about commercial insight, commercial teaching and tailoring and taking control. And it's very highly insight driven. There are others like Corporate Visions that are much more about the behavioral science, decision science, and they use that to drive high influence. And then there's others like the Trusted Advisor that lean heavily into trust. But what Imparta found, which was really interesting and quite useful, is that sellers who have even a moderate level of all three of these dimensions in their sales approach outperform sellers that have high capability in only one or two of these areas. So when you think about methodology, when you think about how I drive superior execution as a seller, I need to not only determine what buying situation am I facing, and where is that buyer in their buying journey? What does that mean about which strategy and tactics I use? But then how do I execute those choices, driving all three dimensions of insight, influence, and trust? And so when you consider all the research that I shared from Forrester, from Gartner, from Imparta, from Legacy Vantage Point, which actually leads back to Florida State University, all of this together is how we actually formed this methodology that we offer called 3D Sales Agility. And what it does is it incorporates not only the importance of assessing the buying situation you face to really truly understand and be able to be aware of and understand it and make sense of it, but then how do you choose the right path and then execute that path in a superior way? So how does this come together with all the research that I've shared? Well, situational agility helps us understand a complex, often nonlinear buying journey so that we can understand where those buyers are within that journey and adapt our approach accordingly. And as we choose the right approach for each buying situation from a situational readiness perspective, we can then have more confidence that not only the strategy that we deploy, but then how we deploy that based on their stage of the buying journey is important. Finally, the 3D advantage drives superior execution and beats one-dimensional selling by incorporating all three elements of insight, influence, and trust. And you can see there's a reference to the Sales Agility Code book, as well as our white paper on the 3D advantage. So all of the research that we've shared around sales methodology and sales execution points to the fact that the highest performing sellers really are agile. And they do a better job of assessing and understanding the buying situation and making sense of it before, number one, selecting their sales approach, and then number two, executing that approach in a superior way using insight, influence, and trust. So if you have questions on any of this, please capture them and we'll answer those toward the end of our session together. So now we're going to shift our focus a little bit and we're going to talk about how do sales organizations enable their sales force. And we did some really interesting research with training industry around sales enablement. And we're going to share some of that research and what the implications are of that research for not only how do you choose a methodology, but then how do you deploy that in a way that does truly represent the needs of the sales force and, quite frankly, the changing needs of the sales force. So one of the things that we looked at in this study was what's the degree to which sales training aligns with organizational goals and objectives. And to do that, we looked at 4 different sets of objectives. We looked at their commercial strategy. How important is that? How important is standardization in their sales process, their talent strategy, and finally, meeting the needs of individual salespeople. And although the talent strategy and meeting the needs of individual salespeople are slightly higher than the commercial strategy or standardization, it wasn't really statistically significant. So what we found is that not only should training needs be aligned with the commercial needs, but there's 4 aspects of that we need to consider when we consider training content and how that training is deployed. So when you think about these 4 objectives, what we found over time is these 4 objectives drive 5 different use cases as it relates to training. And before I get into the individual use cases, what we also find that kind of forms the basis for this chart that you're seeing is there tends to be a bit of a tension between the talent strategy primarily driven by HR and the commercial strategy primarily driven by, executive leadership and sales leadership. So do we focus on, the competencies, or do we focus on driving the revenue? And those 2 should be directly aligned, but they aren't always. And there's also this tension between, do we really want to standardize our approach across the sales force? And to what degree does that take into consideration individual needs? So standardization versus individual needs. So these tensions exist. And because these tensions exist, they drive the need to approach enablement differently for these 5 use cases. So the first and probably most well understood use case is this idea of training courses. So courses and career pathways. So when you think about buying sales training, oftentimes what you're thinking about is you're going to buy a specific methodology or a specific type of content, and you're going to get that content deployed in the form of a course. Now, these courses tend to be strung together to form career pathways as it relates to the talent strategy. When you think about standardized approaches on commercial strategy, this sort of lower left-hand quadrant, what we tend to see there is what we call campaigns. So when we say standardized, we mean there's a need that crosses the entire sales force. And by commercial strategies, we say there's an emerging need that may come up for something that's happening in the marketplace, that's happening in the economy, such as COVID hits, supply chain issues hit. And we have to learn how to, do price increases and have price increase discussions with our clients. So that would be a standardized approach to equipping the sales force to drive a price increase, but it would only happen maybe one time or in a quarter, not year over year. When we think about sort of the intersection between individual needs and commercial strategy, this is really where the use case of contextual learning comes into play. What I mean by that is, let's just say I'm a seller and I'm working on an individual opportunity, and I find that a new competitor has entered this deal. Then I might want to go into my CRM and I might want to do some sort of competitive mapping about how my solution maps against their solution within my CRM. I might even then go into that tool and learn that, wow, I don't really know that much about how to do a value map, say. Let me figure out how to do that. So let me click on a learning module, a 15-minute learning module that helps me understand what is a value map and how do I use it so I can then better utilize that tool within my CRM. The 4th use case is sort of this sort of intersection between talent strategy and individual needs. And this has more to do with competency development. So me as an individual salesperson, I might have done a competency assessment, and based on my role, I find that I've got some deficiency as it relates to deal qualification. And my managers mentioned that maybe it's showing up in my win rate. So I know that I have some competency issues around deal qualification. So I may want to go and do a couple of learning modules around deal qualification and discovery. So Those are the four primary use cases, but the fifth one I think you'll find interesting, and that's curiosity. So this is where AI and sort of smart platforms come into a play, sales aware platforms. So think about Netflix for sales. So, Netflix is always recommending a new movie or a new series for me to watch based on what I've already watched. And sales aware technology is beginning to do the same. So let's just say in my prior example, I went and I did a module on deal qualification. Well, based on the fact that I went through a module on deal qualification, it might recommend a particular module on effective questioning techniques because that's related and ancillary to deal qualification. So these 5 use cases represent 5 different ways that sales organizations want to access and consume sales content. And when coming up with an enablement strategy, it's important to not only consider courses and career pathways, but to consider these other 4 use cases because they're all relevant and alive and well within the sales force. So what are some of the gaps that we see in each use case? So we asked about these 5, and we asked, to what degree are you currently supporting these use cases? And to what degree do you perceive that you will need to support these use cases in the future? And you can see there's a very large gap across all of the use cases between how they're supporting them now and how they anticipate supporting them in the future. And I think what's actually surprising, it was surprising to us, is that one of the biggest gaps they've identified between current support and future support is this idea of how courses and career pathways are offered in a way that's going to meet the needs of the sales force. So what are some other drivers of change in the way that enablement needs to happen moving into the future? So another question we asked was, what are some of the issues that you face that would cause you to change your approach to sales training, change your sales methodology, change how you deploy it, et cetera? And what you can see here, and I'm not going to go into detail into all of them, but the top 4 have to do with content quality, relevance, and staying up to date with new content, addressing topical issues, and addressing a wide range of skills. So the top 4 drivers of change really have to do with sales content. And so when we think about content, there's a variety of ways that organizations choose to engage with content. Let's start at the bottom. When you think about sales training companies and buying sales training, the first one here is buying third-party content off the shelf. I'm just going to buy it, I'm going to deploy it, I'm not going to customize it. The next one is third-party content that is customized for the organization. The third most preferred way is really having in-house content because I can do whatever I want with it. But the most prevalent way that organizations prefer, or that salespeople prefer to engage in content, is they want third-party content because it's highly credible, but they want the ability to modify it in-house so that it's highly relevant to their organization. And this really drives a preference by some of our largest global clients for this hybrid intellectual property model. And what do I mean by that? By hybrid model, what I really mean is taking a look at what can you do with in-house content, right? There's pros and cons to that. I can highly customize it. My costs are lower. But some of the downsides are that I may not have the research arm or the local expertise in order to stay current. Outsourced IP, the pros are there's lots of research behind it. It typically references global best practice. It's broad and deep. But it may be generic and it may not resonate and it may be expensive. So some of our largest global clients are saying, I really want the best of both worlds. I want your outsourced content, but I want to be able to bring it in-house and do with it what I want, be able to align it to other training I offer, be able to contextualize it in the way that I want for my organization. And so this idea of a hybrid approach and the way that organizations want to consume content really leads to a much more flexible, subscription-oriented approach that we've begun to implement globally. So once I decide what content I want or how I want to deploy that content, Then what I have to do is I have to actually deploy that content in a way that drives change and drives stickiness. And in Imparta, when we launch content with our clients, we use what we call our agile change process. And that process really, it's very well aligned to our agile selling process, because the first thing that we do is we help our clients assess their commercial priorities, their change readiness, their level of knowledge and skills. And there's additional things we can do to assess the organization needs as well. We use those outcomes from our assessments to choose what are the right module and course recommendations and why, and which learning formats would best serve the needs of those needs that we've assessed. We then deploy that learning in a variety of ways: instructor-led, e-learning, sales-enabled playbooks, manager-led learning. That learning is then applied within the flow of work through application and CRM tools, learning in the flow of work, as I mentioned on one of our earlier slides, deal and account coaching, personalized playlists and battle cards. And finally, once you've applied it and you've been applying it, how do you keep that learning fresh? How do you keep it top of mind and reduce the likelihood of that forgetting curve? And we use things like manager toolkits, nudge questions that are just, individual questions that force sellers and managers to think about what they've learned and how they're applying it. So this agile change process not only is a more comprehensive way to ensure that the right learning is applied in the right way, it's applied, and that it's sticky, but it gives organizations confidence that they've taken a more holistic approach to training their sales force. So the last thing that we're going to look at here really is sales technology. And what do we know about sales technology, and what did our research show about what organizations are saying they want as it relates to sales technology? One of the questions that we asked in our recent research with training industry was, what are the biggest gaps in your current approaches to learning regarding micro-learning, democratization of learning? You can see there's a whole list here. And you can see that some of the most important areas in their perspective are around using technology to do assessments of skills and business impact, provide learning in the flow of work, and to provide decision intelligence via dashboards, job aids, etc. One really interesting outcome was that one of the biggest gaps between current support and future demand is around sales-specific learning platforms. Now, most organizations of size have some sort of learning management system. However, that learning management system supports all different organizations within their company, whether it's HR, whether it's finance, whether it's marketing, whether it's sales, whether it's manufacturing, right? So we have sort of learning management systems that are sort of hitting the needs across the organization. And oftentimes those platforms are not as robust or relevant as salespeople and sales forces might require. So in Imparta, we have something called iCoach, and it's a learning experience platform that's fully modular and allows each module that an organization or seller might need to be delivered in a variety of ways to accomplish a variety of outcomes. So I can do instructor-led, I can do virtual instructor-led, I have CRM tools and learning in the flow of work, I can do competency assessments within this platform, and I can even do all types of reinforcement to ensure the learning sticks. So not only do we need a sales-specific platform, we need that platform to do a variety of things. So how do folks want to access these platforms? When we took a look at percentage of salespeople that would like to use learning content in each one of these formats, whether it's complete courses, modular, or micro assets, what was interesting is that by far, the highest percentage of salespeople would rather access complete courses. And second to that, of course, is modules, followed by micro assets. This kind of flies in the face of some of the recent points of view around the fact that sellers just want one little piece of content when they want it. It depends what they're trying to accomplish. Are they trying to learn a new skill, or they're trying to augment their approach to a specific sales call around a specific topic? So all of these different modalities or paths, courses, modules, micro assets, they're useful and relevant in different use cases. So when we're selecting platforms, we should be selecting platforms that not only have a variety of ways that they deploy, but hit these different use cases. So when you think about these 5 use cases, I need modular training and courses. I need campaign-driven learning, maybe perhaps an instructor-led session around price increases. I need tools within the flow of work that I can access within my CRM. And then I need to be able to assess my competencies and determine how do I close those competency gaps. So we've developed at Imparta what we call our Imparta ecosystem. And our ecosystem addresses each of these 3 areas in a very agile and effective way. So our agile 3D model addresses the challenges that we've seen in sales execution, not only from our own research, but the research that we've been able to pivot off of from industry analysts like Forrester and Gartner. Our agile sales enablement not only addresses courses and career pathways and skills libraries, but it addresses these 5 different use cases and 4 additional ones versus just courses, and does that in a way that drives training that sticks. And finally, we have a learning experience platform, iCoach, that is modular and allows sellers and managers to access the kind of learning they need and tools they need at the point of need within their flow of work. So I'm just going to show you very quickly, because you're going to get a copy of these slides. We've got some examples of client impact in each of these areas that we've been able to achieve at Imparta with our clients around sales execution, sales enablement, and sales technology. I know you don't want to read through all of this right now, but know that it's there for your reference if you want to take a look at the power of these different elements of our ecosystem. So Angelica, while my voice is still working, let's have some questions.
It looks like there's no questions in the chat, but again,
Okay.
time to ask Michelle questions. Oh, something came up in the red.
Okay.
Amazing. Thank you, Steve. Steve asked a lot of interesting content here. Agreed. As someone who tends to work with smaller to medium-sized tech orgs, is it a bit overwhelming, especially when coupled with general resistance to training and sales leaders pulling teams out of the field? How do you recommend scaling down? Great question,
Yeah,
Steve.
it is a great question. It is a great question. So I guess the good news for organizations that are either small or deal with smaller organizations is there's so much great content available out there. There's white papers written, there's books written on these topics, and there's a lot of organizations that allow you to access their content in ways that are mostly asynchronous, and Imparta is one of them. So accessing asynchronous content is probably one of the easiest, most flexible, and most cost-effective ways of accessing content that are going to equip your salespeople in this more agile way. So that would be my answer to that.
Thank you. Any more questions now that we have Michelle's Vinciana? Thank you, Steve. You can drop them in the chat or in the Q&A as Steve did, whatever your preference is. We also brought someone in. You remember that time, Michelle, when we had someone come in video?
Oh, that's right. Yes, I do remember that. That was wonderful. So Angelica, while we're waiting for questions,
Yep.
although I stopped sharing my screen, I want to let people that are watching know that there's a couple of calls to action that will be in the slide deck that Angelica sends you. There's a link to our research paper that unpacks the research we did with training industry. And there's also the first 2 chapters of our new book, The Sales Agility Code. Angelica is going to be sending that out along with the slides to all the folks that registered for today's session. So please know that there are next steps you can take if these topics intrigue you and that you'd like to learn more.
Yes, thank you. And I also dropped Michelle's LinkedIn. I'm sure she would love to connect. If you have any questions, you can reach out to her. And I'll also include your email as well. And I'm sure it's included in that slide deck if anyone wants to reach out to you via email.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Angelica.
No problem. Well, it looks like there's no questions. I'm sure if you think of anything, you can reach out to Michelle directly. As Michelle stated, all the recordings along with her slide deck, any white papers, links mentioned, chapters of her book will be made available on the MSP website before the end of the day. We will send out an email, so stay tuned for that. But thank you everyone for attending today's session, and we will see you at the next event. Thank you, Michelle, for your
Thanks,
amazing
Angelica.
wisdom. We will see you next time. Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you. Bye.